We are going live on Facebook. Thanks for all of you on Zoom for bearing with us while we do that. And then we'll start. I just have to make sure it's up. Which it is. All right. Goodness gracious. Welcome one and all to our Zoom world. And just to let you know, I see 40 participants already on Zoom, and this program is also streaming live right now on Harvard Hillel's Facebook page, where even more are joining us as we speak. So much has fallen silent in this time. And it's so important that creative expression, which is really the bird song of our species, not fall silent. So thank you for being here to do our part in ensuring that it goes on, that song goes on, that creativity goes on, that sharing art goes on during this time when we really need it a lot. My name is Jonah Steinberg, and I'm the executive director at Harvard Hillel, a member of our multi-denominational clergy and program team, and a Jewish chaplain at Harvard. I'm also joined here by Rabbi Jen Queen, newly arrived this year, and what a first year this is turning out to be as our Reform Rabbi and Director of Engagement at Harvard Hillel. We brought Jen here with a portfolio of campus engagement, and now we've taken the campus away. So I'm really glad that Jen is being so integral a part of Harvard Hillel in this online existence. And more from Jen in just a moment. But first, our honored guest and the reason we're all here. And just to say a word about that word here, thank you to all of you for letting Harvard Hillel into your homes this evening. And Alicia, thank you for letting us into yours. With us, I am so glad, is Alicia Jo Rabins, who joins us, or we join her in Portland, Oregon, where she lives with her partner in life and music, Aaron Hartman, and their 2 children. And if this will be your first time meeting Alicia, then wow, am I delighted and honored to be the one to introduce you to her. And I'm quite sure there are some longtime followers of Alicia's already here with us, and I know that some of our current Harvard Hillel students already are fans. Alicia is, Alicia is, thank God. Alicia is a composer, a singer-songwriter, a poet whose first book, Divinity School, won the American Poetry Review's Honickman First Book Prize. And I once went to the Public Theater in Brooklyn to see Alicia's rock opera, A Kaddish for Bernie Madoff, which I still maintain Harvard Hillel should bring to campus someday in partnership with our economics department. I'm going to put in a request for a piece from that as we go on. Alicia is a teacher of Torah whose particular blend of learnedness, reverence, and chutzpah really does bear comparison to the sages of classical midrash and to the Hasidic masters. And Alicia is, to me, a friend. We first met in England 15 years ago, a Rebbe, and an honorary sibling. And none of those are terms I use lightly, and the last 2 almost never. What do I mean by Rebbe? I mean that Alicia's way in the world is, to me, inspiring, exemplary, and sacred. And what makes it so special and valuable, perhaps especially now, but always, is that the sacredness is not separate in Alicia's instance and her articulation from the grit of this world and of human existence in it. Alicia's newest book of poetry, Fruit Geode, is a bloody good book. And the bloodiness is as true and as important as the goodness. It's the kind of bloodiness, in fact, that makes an appearance courtesy of the prophet Ezekiel in our Passover Haggadah. The blood of birth, of pubescence, of body through the course of life, of vulnerability, of mortality, the blood that makes us human and somehow also ties us to the divine. And I can't think of a more relevant crimson thread, so to speak, for us to consider in these times. So with that, I'm going to stop speaking and let Alicia start, and also hand a lot of the moderation over aside from a couple of requests I can't help lobbing in, but to Rabbi Jen. But over to Alicia to start however she wants, speaking, singing, being with us. And thanks, Alicia, and thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Jonah, for those beautiful words. It's amazing to hear that coming from you because I respect you so profoundly. And thank you everyone for being here. And as Jonah said, making art and being together in a space of art and creativity, I think is especially crucial during this kind of time. And so it's a privilege to be making art with you, in this virtual community together in this very real moment. I'm going to play a bunch of songs today, as well as read some poems. And most of the songs that I'm playing are from a song cycle called Girls in Trouble, which I'll tell you more about later. But I just want to sort of frame for you before I dive in that they're all songs about women in the Torah. So they're based on textual research into Torah stories, and then often also rabbinic midrashic commentary. And then I make my own commentary in the form of a song, which I usually sing almost always in their voice, my version of their voice. And what you can't really see, I might show you later if I get brave enough to move my computer, is that I'm stepping on some electronics down here. If you play music, you might know about loop pedals, which are essentially magical boxes. It's one magical box that you step on, it records what you're playing, and then it plays it back again. So you'll hear me play something live, and then you'll hear that continue to recur. And just so you know, it's not like a backing track, it's something that I'm building live, and you'll probably see me move around a little bit as I'm stepping on it. So this first song that I'm going to play for you is about Sarah Bat Asher, who is pretty obscure. She doesn't get much written about her in the Torah, but she does get mentioned, which means that she's important. And so the rabbis come up with a lot of legends around her, some of which are among my favorite midrashim, my favorite rabbinic legends, to say why she's important. And she lived, according to tradition, at the time of the Exodus. And so she's very relevant to Passover. And I really love to invoke her at this moment. I think that, we think about Moses, we think about Miriam, and they're kind of on the ground in the nitty gritty of the Israelites' experience. And then Sarah is a little bit more of a mystical kind of Elijah figure, right? So if I were to make a cup that paralleled the Elijah's cup, I would actually make a cup for Sarah Bat Asher at the Seder, because she's a bit of a mystical figure. So we can talk a little more about the specific traditions that are in this song, but the whole song is, I've written it in her voice, when she goes to tell her uncle, her great uncle, Jacob, that his favorite son, Joseph, is still alive. So the song is called Tell Me. Watch them shining in the dark. I iron wall came down to hold them. Has there been a loneliness like mine, touching all the hidden walls of time? Okay, I'm gonna grab my guitar here. It's funny that only being, having such a small area that's visible, I haven't quite figured out how to change instruments without disappearing from the frame. So now I'm gonna play a song about Miriam in honor of our preparation for Passover. Although, when I sat down to write my song about Miriam, I thought there's already been a lot of attention paid to the triumphant moments in her life, and rightly so. Wonderful songs about her leading the women in song after the crossing of the sea, and praying for Moses to be, praying for the community and finding the water in the desert. And so she's been kind of, claimed by feminists in a wonderful way. But I was so interested in a passage that comes later in the story of her life, when not that long after crossing the sea, the Israelites are wandering in the desert, and Miriam and Aaron criticize their brother Moses to God, and God strikes only Miriam with leprosy, which it's important to emphasize, I think, is not a physical disease. It was even then seen as a spiritual ailment, right? And so her skin turns white as snow, and gives her this very harsh punishment of having to go out alone in the desert for 2 weeks. And the people, even Moses prays for her to be healed. And so God kind of relents and says, okay, she can go for just 7 days. But God has this really wild line in the book of Numbers. If her father spit in her face, wouldn't she have to bear her shame for 7 days? So, I find it tempting, everyone finds it tempting, I think, to turn away from these moments of difficulty and suffering and injustice in the Torah, especially when it's the character of God who seems to be acting so unjustly. But I also have the opposite impulse, which is to sit with these moments and to sit with the characters, especially the women characters, in these moments of challenge or struggle. Because as we all know right now, life has triumphant moments, thankfully, and then we also have moments of challenge. This happens on a personal level, on a communal level, on a global level. And so I think that it's kind of a counterbalance to the celebration of Miriam's leadership and kind of success, to also spend some time with her in this moment of challenge and not abandon her there. So I wrote this song in her voice about that week alone in the desert, wondering if maybe it might be a bit of a parallel to Moses's time alone on Sinai, receiving the Torah. And by the way, if you have any trouble hearing the lyrics, if you want, you can go to girlsintroublemusic.com. Don't leave out the music or you end up on unsavory corners of the internet. So girlsintroublemusic.com. And if you type in Miriam, you'll come up with the page of her song, which has all the lyrics on it. So if that's helpful for accessibility reasons, feel free to, do that on your phone or whatever while I'm playing. This is called Snow, Scorpions, and Spiders. Well, my mother named me Bitter, although as a child I was so kind, hiding myself in the reeds to watch over my brother. But still my name was Bitter, bitter the taste of the sea, bitter the cries of the horses drowning behind us. If anybody had asked me, I might not have chosen to go. But everyone knows sometimes you don't have a choice. So when he said you're banished 7 days in the desert alone, I just started walking. I knew there was nothing to say. The scorpions and the spiders crawled up to me and stopped in my shade. Together in silence we watched as the sun crossed the sky. If anybody had asked me, I might not have chosen to go. But everyone knows sometimes you don't have a choice. And if your father spit in your face, wouldn't you want to leave that place? And if your skin should turn to snow, wouldn't you have to go? And if your God should turn from you, wouldn't you turn too? Still, I don't regret a minute, and I don't regret an hour of the week that I lived all alone at the top of the mountain. Though no voice came down from heaven, and I never saw words written in fire, I did see the birds of prey pick all the carcasses clean. If anybody had asked me, I might not have chosen to go. But everyone knows sometimes you don't have a choice. And if your father spit in your face, wouldn't you want to leave that place? And if your skin should turn to snow, wouldn't you have to go? And if your God should turn from you, wouldn't you turn too? So I think I'm going to talk a little bit with Rabbi Jen now. And I also just want to say I'm very open to questions. And actually, Lori also really helpfully posted a link to the lyrics for that last song in the chat field. So if you don't have the chat field open, if anyone wants to keep doing that, if that'll help people understand what I'm saying, because I know it can be hard through the screen. Yeah, I'm looking forward to having conversations with Rabbi Jen and Jonah, and actually also all of you over the next hour.
Thank you so much, Alicia. Oh my goodness, this is so incredible to get to see you and chat with you and hear your music in real time. I first learned about your music while I was in rabbinical school, and it was just such a beautiful opportunity to engage both deeply and differently with Jewish text. And I love how in your Girls in Trouble song cycle and the accompanying curriculum, which is available for download online, by the way, everybody. So each piece of music, as you mentioned, focuses not just on a biblical or a midrashic imagination of a woman, but also on liturgy about women. You have a piece about Eshet Chayil, which for many of us contemporary Jewish feminists is, I'll say, a challenging text. And these aren't necessarily start to finish stories, but rather like each piece highlights a specific aspect or moment in their lives. I really love your piece, River So Wide, which presents the midrash about Sarah learning about the Akedah and her response to it. Or like you mentioned about your Miriam narrative, that you wanted to lift up the less triumphant and I'll say more human moments in these women's lives. You talked a little bit, but I'm hoping that you might share a little bit more with us about your process of how you become better acquainted with these women, and how you choose which aspects of their story to lift up. And I'm also wondering in that, how has writing music about these women changed your relationship to the Bible or to Jewish tradition and text?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just back way up and say, I think it's important for me to say that I did not grow up in a family with a lot of Jewish practice around. Both my parents are Jewish, so we did some holidays and stuff, but we lived in a very non-Jewish area, so none of my friends were Jewish, and we weren't very involved. And so I grew up, I think of it as sort of religiously Jewish, but culturally Protestant in a lot of ways, and without a lot of Jewish education. I did have a bat mitzvah, and then I got really interested in it when I was in college at Barnard. And there's whole stories around that I can tell if Jonah asked me to. But and so then after I graduated, I went to Pardes, which, if you don't know of it, is a really wonderful, pretty progressive co-ed interdenominational yeshiva in Jerusalem. And I thought I would go for 1 year to just sort of learn about Jewish text, and I ended up staying for 2 years and becoming so fully immersed in the study and practice. And so, on the other hand, I did have this very deep classical training as a musician and also as a writer. So in a way, that was my spiritual practice growing up. And so this project for me is so meaningful because it fuses these two, really three forms of practice that I'm so devoted to and that I'm so grateful to be able to interact with, of music, writing, words, and then Jewish text study. And the project itself began when I was getting a master's in Jewish Women's and Gender Studies at JTS, the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. And so I was doing all this research on women in Midrash, right, in rabbinic legends, and the women they came alive for me in this really intense way, even more than they had when I was in yeshiva, because I spent 2 years really focused on these legends of women. And then when I was going to write my thesis, my advisor, Rabbi Bert Visotsky, who's a wonderful scholar, he basically noticed that I was really procrastinating, which is not usually my MO. And he was like, what's going on, And I pretty much realized that, there are brilliant academics who, when they write a paper, they bring the ideas more to life. But I'm not that kind of academic. I'm an artist, right? So I realized that if I wrote this paper, it would squish these women who had come to life for me back into a two-dimensional form, which is not what I wanted. And he, bless him, said, well, he had come to see me perform downtown, because that whole time I was living in New York, I was working as a musician. And he said, well, I think I could probably get you credit to write songs about them if you really annotate the songs with all of your research, so that it's clear that you're not getting out of the research, that you're just putting it into a different form. And so this project began as my master's thesis, and it was just maybe 5 of the songs. And so there's so much text already in it. And I'm really appreciative as an artist to be able to draw on the amazing wealth of essentially indigenous traditions that we have textually, like our beautiful myths and legends and traditions of commentary and of midrash. So you know, all that said, by the time I started writing the songs, I was already feeling a kind of kinship with each of the women. And I sometimes have this sense of like, you know, sometimes people ask me like, what's your favorite story or your favorite woman character? And I really can't choose. I have this sense of them all being in this kind of connected, like stars in the sky or something, right? And so at different moments, something about one story feels more relevant, or something about another story will feel more relevant, but they all kind of add up in my mind to this amazing kind of community, this aggregate of human experience, and they feel like friends, which I think is in large part because I've been writing about them. And for the last 13 years, I've been touring and performing these songs about them. There are 3 albums of Girls in Trouble songs, which they're wherever you get music. So I've really had this kind of life out in the world, both in the Jewish world and in the kind of just indie rock music folk world with these. And that's been beautiful too, to have these women accompany me into synagogues one night and rock clubs the next night, and house concerts other times, and you know, things like this. I was lucky enough to play it physically at the Harvard Hillel in 2015 when I was on a tour. So yeah, and the other thing I'll say is just that, as you know, Midrash is so beautiful because it allows us to unfold the text over time, right? And this process that is not, it's not frozen, it's 4-dimensional. And even with my own songs, I have the experience of my understanding deepening of these stories, and kind of echoing out into deeper levels. I mean, like when I became a mother, I had a different perspective on a lot of the women's stories. And I moved from New York, where I'd lived for so long, to Portland, Oregon, because that's where my husband was based. And that gave me a different, that was my first really major physical geographical dislocation. And I suddenly understood things about, for example, Ruth's story that had been not as clear to me before. So I feel like, thank God, you know, there's this just this realm of story that has the power to accompany us through everything we go through, including pandemics. You know, everything in the human experience, I think, is contained in the Torah and probably in every sacred text. And this is sort of my way of walking through that. So maybe I'll go into this song about Hannah, or Hannah, who I have a special affinity for because that's my Hebrew name. And her story is a little more famous. So I'll just briefly say that she has trouble conceiving a child, is really despairing over it. She goes to the temple and she's praying so hard that her lips are moving and no sound is coming out. And the priest walks in on her praying and says, "You woman, you've obviously been drinking. Get out of here. You're not allowed to drink and then come in." And so that is basically what I would have imagined before I got my religious education. I would have imagined like, okay, it's this ancient, you know, patriarchal society. And so the men talk down to the women and they don't trust them. But what happens in the text itself next is that she comes back and she actually speaks up for herself. And this is not some later feminist rewriting. This is the text, the book of Samuel. And she comes back and she says, you know, I wasn't drunk, I was praying. And the next thing that happens is that the priest listens to her and apologizes and says, your prayer will be answered. And later the rabbis make her the model for the Amidah, which is one of the most, you know, central prayers in the service, and which we traditionally recite silently so that our lips are moving, but no sound is coming out, just like Hannah. And I found that really moving. So I wrote this song about her in her voice called Marble Floor. I opened up my mouth, but no words came, and I laid down to sleep, but I did not dream. Oh, 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 oh. I looked up to the sky, but the stars were dark, like a mirror held up to my heart. somebody else. Oh, 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 oh. So I got down on my knees on the marble floor, and I cried until my throat was sore. Oh, 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 oh. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Tell me what you want from me. I'll do it all, I swear. On the album, there's a glockenspiel solo, but I'll just keep going. I was not drunk, I was awake. I could not open, so I had to break to let the light come in. Oh, oh. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Take this alphabet from me. It's heavy on my tongue. Thank you, Lori Goldman, for posting the lyrics in the chat field. Appreciate it. And then I think, yeah, Rabbi Jen's going to ask me another question.
Thank you. So much of your music, like the song that we just heard about Hannah's struggle with fertility, and Miriam's experience of Tzaraat that you that was mentioned in the song before. So your music and your poetry focuses so much on women's experience and also intensely human, visceral, bodily experience, pain, illness, childbirth, and particularly, as Rabbi Jonah mentioned in your newest book of poetry, Fruit Geode. These experiences are universal. However, our embodied lives are not often talked about in public. That is, interestingly enough, until now, where it seems that so much of what all of us are doing these days is talking about and reading about and speculating about this, this illness, this virus that has affected so many and will affect so many of us. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how your treatment of the human body in your work has helped you in this time. And how has your perception of the body changed in light of recent events?
Well, I think many artists kind of have central obsessions that they work through over decades. And one of mine is time, and another of mine is definitely the body. I have always been mystified by the fact of living in a body. I mean, it's so basic, but it has never stopped being completely mysterious to me. How far we can go with our minds, but how utterly impossible it is to exist for a second without our bodies, right? And I also kind of believe in the body as a teacher. And I'm really interested in, sort of mystical traditions, in Judaism and in other traditions of embodied spirituality, of like the idea of the Sfirot, which is kind of like the Jewish chakras, and how the kind of energy centers of the divine are mirrored in our own bodies. And so my favorite kinds of spiritual and religious practices often link us to the body. And I think also that stories of women in the Torah are often written on their bodies, not always, but often written on their bodies in a way, or through their bodies. And I think that's part of what draws me to them. There's a wonderful scholar who has talked about how there's less pressure on the stories of women in a patriarchal society to kind of represent a certain kind of model. And so that actually opens up those stories of women to be more complex and kind of multidimensional and to explore things like embodied existence that is messy, right? It's not like a kind of militaristic, heroic story, the story being in a body. It's a complex, multifarious, unpredictable, kind of mind-boggling, emotionally linked. There's so much about it. And so that the Torah can explore these sometimes these elements of existence more easily through stories of women. So I think for me that just all comes together into I am someone who, if something doesn't kind of help me get through the day, I'm not that interested in it. I don't have a lot of abstract interests. So I love art and spiritual practice and all kinds of things that help me negotiate or understand better what it is to be in a body. And I think that I try to, a lot of my writing and my music is me thinking through those same exact questions. It's kind of how I deal with my own questions. I'm going to play a violin song now, and then I'd love to, if there are any questions from participants, I'd love to hear them. So this song does not have any words. It is an instrumental, and it's about the character of Judith, who is apocryphal, right? Her story doesn't quite make it into the Jewish Tanakh, the Jewish canon, but we still have her story. And she is this beautiful young widow in a time of war who is the only one who can come up with the strategy to defeat the enemy general Holofernes. And it involves her sneaking into his tent in the middle of the night, kind of winning his favor, and killing him, which sounds so violent, but really he was actually laying siege to her town. And so, children were dying of hunger. And so to end this war, I always think to end this war with just one casualty on the enemy side being their general is actually a very compassionate way to end a war. So this is a song that I wrote as a bit of a soundtrack for that night in the tent. And because of the way that she killed him, it's called Waltz for a Beheading. And it has some klezmer. I really love klezmer, so it's got some klezmer flavor to it. So if there are questions, I'm really happy to take them. If you just want me to keep playing, I'm really happy to do that. And sure. I see the question in the chat that says, who is the scholar that you referred to? And, it's in the foreword to the Girls in Trouble curriculum, and I'm totally blank. She's like a friend in Berkeley, and I'm totally blanking on her name right now, but I can I can send it out later. I don't want to take time to look it up right now. I'm sorry about that.
If there are questions. I am happy to receive them over the chat, or you can send them directly to Alicia, or you can use the raise your hand function, and I can try to find you and call on you. Just to start off, I do have a couple of questions from Lauren Cohen-Fisher, who is a former staff member at Harvard Hillel and beloved community member of ours. So Lauren asks, where do you draw the line between artistic liberty or innovation and staying true to the text and its traditional commentary when you're working on pieces of music and getting acquainted with these women?
I love that question. I try to stick to what I observe as kind of the midrashic rules that traditional, rabbinic midrashists use, which was, as I see it, you can't really contradict the details, the pshat, the actual things that happen in the original story, but you can go pretty far afield in terms of imaginatively adding or kind of tweaking motivations or adding events that didn't happen in there. So I would say in 98% of my songs, I'm really faithful to the details of the story, and I'm trying to just kind of open them up and add extra elements, but to really stick to those original details, because otherwise the form of midrash, I think, becomes less meaningful. There is the occasional time when I decide to just consciously rewrite something a little bit, but I have to have what seems like a good reason to me.
That's great.
I see a question in the chat. How did you choose which women to voice, and are there any others you'd like to write a song for? That's also a great question. I did want to look at moments of challenge and trouble, which is why I called it Girls in Trouble. I have definitely fewer stories about characters having, amazing times. I also, on the other side, I don't want to be an apologist for the truly awful stories, and I don't want to kind of, rewrite. There's certain stories that are really on the far edge that are so kind of violent and awful that I don't want to turn them into songs and make, that seems like giving attention to the wrong element, actually. But most stories don't fall into that category. And I'm currently working on an Esther story, an Esther song, which I'm surprised it's taken me this long. I've had a Vashti song for a long time, but so it really just comes down to usually what's striking me at the moment. Sometimes I've gotten commissions, like that Hannah song was a commission from synagogue in Brooklyn called Kol Chayenu that I used to teach at. And they asked me to write that for Rosh Hashanah because we read the story of Hannah on Rosh Hashanah. So sometimes it comes through requests, but often I just kind of am drawn to a specific song or would just kind of, something would get stuck in my head and work itself out into a little phrase. And then before I know it, I'm off to the races. And then, well, I'll say one more, which this was private, so you can't see it, but Jay in Toronto wrote, how does this song happen versus a poem? That's also a really good question. I think of a song as something that can, my poems tend to sort of go I try to go super deep into one moment, and a poem, you can go so deep into a moment that you can end up 3,000 years in the future or 3,000 years in the past. So it's a little bit paradoxical. It's so deep into the depth of one moment of experience that it connects to everything else. So they're a little bit more free ranging in a way, but also more confined. And these songs, I might be taking a point in a character's story, but I am trying to kind of capture something of the flavor of a specific character, and I'm singing in her voice. So it's a little more theatrical. I'm actually working on a musical. I'm in the very early stages of working on a musical based on these songs. So it's more narrative, more theatrical, and the music does so much of the work that the words don't have to convey all of the emotion like in a poem. So most of my poems are not about women in Torah per se. There are a few of them, but my poems tend to be a little more about being alive and the mysteries of that, and drawing a lot on texts, but not as much focusing on stories of women. So for me, the practical difference is more that if I'm writing Girls in Trouble songs, they have to be about a woman in Torah, and in poetry, everything is fair game. And maybe I'll answer this one more question. I'll do some more music and poetry. So Lauren Cohen Fisher wrote, who are your rabbis broadly defined? Rabbi Jonah, for sure. Rabbi Bert Vizatsky that I mentioned, who's my advisor at JTS. There's an amazing Zen monk who's also Jewish named Norman Fisher in San Francisco, who's also a poet. So I really love his work. Dr. Aviva Zornberg I got to study with her when I was at Pardes, and she was a huge influence for me in terms of looking at kind of psychoanalytic literary theory and Torah and realizing you can put things like that together. I mean, J.S. Bach, like I'm kind of a Baroque freak, so I love the way that music turns into kind of a puzzle that's also a thing of great emotional beauty. So that's a big influence on me. And probably I have to say my children teach me most of all, often by showing me my own limitations, and then I have to, grow beyond them. So I would love to play actually a cover right now. This is from a band called the Magnetic Fields, and they have these albums called 69 Love Songs, and this is called Book of Love. And I don't think he meant this to be about the Torah, but I like to think of it as being about our book of love. So. The book of love is long and boring. No one can lift the damn thing. It's full of charts and facts and figures and instructions for dancing. But I love it when you read to me, and you can read me anything. The book of love has music in it. In fact, that's where music comes from. Some of it is just transcendental. Some of it is just really dumb. But I love it when you sing to me, and you can sing me anything. The book of love is long and boring and written very long ago. It's full of flowers and heart-shaped boxes and things we're all too young to know. But I love it when you give me things, and you ought to give me wedding rings. Yes, I love it when you give me things, and you ought to give me wedding rings. I think I'd love to read a few very short poems for you now. Thank you. I see some hands. It's so funny to have like silence, but I also appreciate the silence because that's what makes it work. So we have been talking about poems, but I haven't read any. So just to give you a taste of that form of my work, which also has a lot to do with Torah in my mind, explicitly. So this is my first book, Divinity School. And woven throughout is a series of how-to poems, which are very inspired by Mishnah, which is the Jewish the kind of literary form in Judaism, which many of you know, of kind of brief instructional texts, right? And I love the practicality, and I love that because they were passed down orally for so long before being written down, I always think of them as being like stones that have been washed clean in a river or something, and washed smooth. They needed to be memorable, so there's no extra, right? It's a kind of a little pout, like here's how you do this, here's how you do this. Of course, because it's Judaism, there's like debates, preserved within them. But so I have this series, as I said, woven through this book of kind of surreal how-to poems that draw in some way on Torah, but often kind of turn it upside down. So this first one is very short. You can see it's 11 words. It's called How to Tell Time, and it's appropriate for this season because it's based on the idea that after the Israelites left Egypt, when they were wandering in the desert and the manna fell, they could collect as much as they needed for that day. But if they tried to gather extra, it would just rot unless they were gathering it for Shabbat. So this is called How to Tell Time. Now, like manna, is perfectly sufficient and will rot if stored. It's my little Buddhist Jewish poem. Now this one is called How to Graduate, which I always like to read if there's any excuse to have, if there's any academic connection at all. In a reading, I'll read this one. And this is based on the idea that the Torah is a love letter, right, from God to the Jewish people. And it also draws on, I don't know if any of you ever wrote with lemon juice and then as invisible ink as children, and then held a candle underneath it to make it kind of visible, but that's referred to in here. How to Graduate. God wrote me a letter in invisible ink, but I got overwhelmed. The parchment, the lemon juice, the light, and the candle, I accidentally set it on fire. For 40 days and nights, the smell of caramel surrounded me. And when it receded, I sent out my only dove. And you can see here that this actually looks like, it looks like Jewish text, right? If you've ever studied Talmud, it's sort of a, it's a left justified, right justified rectangle of text, which is not usually how poems look, but that's how I made most of the prose poems in this how-to section. Okay, this one, How to Sail, is one that does have a story of a woman in Torah. So I did want to read this as an example of that. She's not really a woman, she's a category. It's the Sota, who is a woman accused of adultery with no witnesses. So you end up in this very messy situation, and there's a very unpleasant ritual where she has to drink this kind of potion with the letters of God in it. And, there are interpretations where that's actually helpful because it gives her a way out, because if nothing happens after the potion, then she's considered to be innocent, but it's still a pretty disturbing passage. So I have a song about that. That's called Secrets. But this is my poem about it, which is also based on the fact that I tutor bar mitzvah students and b'nai mitzvah students. And I've been doing it for a really long time. It's an ongoing practice I've had for 23 years, often online, often remotely, usually unaffiliated students who aren't part of a specific synagogue community. And so this one of my students named Molly is in here because I've taught this portion to 4 girls over the years, but just based on when their birthdays are, they ended up learning this story. So this is for them. How to Sail. Scrape the curse off the parchment, stir the broken letters into a jar of water, make the woman drink it. Thus said Elohim. But why? Thus said Molly, 12 years old. Now I was the teacher. We sat there, 2 black flames in a room of white fire. We were sailing on a wind that passed through the open window of a room next to the marketplace 2,000 years ago. And I'll read one more very short one before doing another song and then taking some more questions. So this is actually based on a Hasidic teaching, it's not from the Torah, right? So it's more recent, so deep, so beautiful. And it's a teaching that you may be familiar with. So I did credit in the back of the book that this isn't my idea. I just kind of restated it, but the title is mine. So the title is How to Assess Your Net Worth. How to assess your net worth. Take 2 small pieces of paper. On one, write The world was created for me. On the other, I am only dust and ashes. Put one in each pocket, never leave the house without them. So those are some poems from Divinity School. I do find that in this moment, poetry is so great because I don't have the attention span to read. Just as a reader, as a consumer of literature, I can't read books right now. I'm just too overwhelmed. But I can read poems because they're short. So I'm endlessly grateful to this form. And I'm gonna play another song before opening it up for more. And I know there are a couple questions that I didn't get to address before. So this song, if anyone wants to look it up and post in the chat, is called We Are Androgynous. It's about Lilith. And very briefly, if you don't know the amazing story of Lilith, it's not really in the Torah. It's kind of a legend that's linked to the fact that in the Torah, there are two creation stories, and there's two versions of the Adam and Eve creation. And in the first, man and woman are created as one being and then split, right? And in the second, there's Adam, and then God takes Adam's rib or side and makes Eve out of that. There's so many ways of looking at this, right? But one very mystical, intense way is that it's actually a sequential story. It's not two ways of telling the same moment, but that it's a sequential story. And what happened was that first woman was not Eve. She was Lilith, kind of a proto-Eve. And because she was made of the same material and kind of 50% of the original being, when they were split, she thought that she should have an equal vote to Adam. And she started having demands of him. And Adam was horrified and went to God and said, how am I supposed to live with this? And God was like, you're right, I'm sorry, I messed up. So they banish Lilith. And then God takes Eve, according to this reading. Then God takes Eve out of Adam's side so that she will always know she's subservient. Now, scholars think that there's a good chance Lilith is based on actually a pre-Israelite storm demoness named Lilitu that kind of worked her way into, the Israelite myths because they're all neighboring cultures. And amazingly, this legend has kind of stayed alive in the imaginations of Jews over the centuries. And she's been really feared, Lilith, because there are all these terrible legends about she becomes this demoness who is really dangerous to pregnant women and to babies and all kinds of things. So of course I wanted to write a positive song about Lilith and a love song. And I went to the this beautiful this midrash in which in the Talmud, when they're talking about what was that original being like, and they use the word androgynous, which is a Greek word, right, for like this kind of being that is neither sex or both sexes, both genders, sexes. And so I wanted to write a love song where I'm sort of rewinding back to that, and where I'm thinking that perhaps Lilith did really love Adam, and maybe their story was actually a love story, but it was, maybe 3,000 years ahead of its time in terms of being ready for equality. And so this love song in Lilith's voice is called We Are Androgynous. And I'm going to use this loop pedal again. Okay. to form us, to guide us and shape us until we are ready to walk away. We are, 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 we are. Androgynous, double-faced beings, torn from each other and rendered into two flaming swords guard the Garden of Eden. But I won't go back there without you. Thank you. So let's see, there's a couple questions that are private to me, so you can't see them, but I'll just quickly, it says, taking on the persona, Dan says, taking on the persona, finding the voice and words of women within narratives that have, here, I'm gonna paste this into the chat. Everyone. Okay, you can see it in the chat field. So basically, has it altered my understanding or experience of time to study these stories and inhabit them? Yes, totally. I mean, time, like the body, is a mystery.